get started. We are going to record this event. So if anybody is missing out on the earlier parts, they can get to learn from the video on the YouTube channel. But welcome, everybody. This is a Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program workshop series for the fall. We call this Idea to Funding. It's an educational workshop series intended to provide tools and education for scientists like yourself and engineers and aspiring entrepreneurs to translate research to startups. The topic for today's workshop is building startup teams. It's one of the biggest reasons why startups fail. So we thought we'll bring some experts in this space who have seen it all firsthand, secondhand, to share their observations and how they can help you build strong teams. Before I talk about the speakers, I want to quickly introduce the BPEP team. BPEP, our mission is to foster entrepreneurship among Berkeley postdocs and grad students through educational awareness. As grad students and postdocs, they don't ever teach us how to do startups. So we thought we started the program about 10 years ago and still going strong. We have about 30 startups that came out of the program from Berkeley and LBNL. So we are proud of what we achieved. All credit goes to the founders. We did nothing. We just got the awareness there. So here's our team. Saad is a chair. Alex is a professor. He was a visiting scholar, but he's reaching out from Brazil. He's been a part of the team. Jen, Tennessee, Srinidhi, and Ajay. These programs wouldn't be possible without all these program managers. Now, to our program speakers today, Mikhail Host. He supports the teams at Citrus Foundry Incubator, and he's a contact person for intra-UC connections. Mikhail's expertise lies in entrepreneurship at the intersection of technology and social impact. He brings a decade of experience working with early stage companies in go-to-market, business development, fundraising, partnership, and communications. He's done it all. Previously, he was the senior portfolio manager at Singularity University Ventures, a startup ecosystem that funds, supports, and coaches startup companies. He's worked with about 70 startup companies who went on to raise about $1 billion. So there's a lot of experience that you can gain from Mikhail. Shravan, another good friend of mine for a long time. He's the CEO of Hyperspec AI. He's responsible for leading the technology, strategy, and operations at the startup. Previous to Hyperspec, he was founding CEO of Civil Maps and led algorithm developer. He was a lead developer at Samba TV. At Civil Maps, Shravan invented point cloud fingerprinting. At Samba TV, Shravan developed the world's most advanced automatic content recognition system for linear broadcast using computer vision. His algorithm is deployed in more than 46 million smart televisions worldwide. So you must be watching one of his programs because of him. Shravan excels at developing high-performance computer vision algorithms on resource-constrained edge computing devices. So first-hand experiences, he's going to share a lot of them. So I was thinking, okay, how do I start about teams? There's nothing better than this poster here about Ocean's 11. Where you have George Clooney, the CEO, recruiting a bunch of people. Nobody's perfect there, but then everybody has their own expertise. One can open logs, one can short circuit cameras and do things. But then they were successful at the end of that movie in robbing the bank. So this is just a preview of the kinds of things you'll be doing in a good way. You won't be robbing banks, but you'll be bringing in revenues. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand it over to Mikhail to take over the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Naresh. Yeah, very, very happy to be here. Very excited to meet you all. This is a topic I am very interested in. I've got probably more experience in this than is really necessary, but that's just how my career has worked out. So as Naresh said, I spent about 7.5 years in my last company, a venture-backed startup called Singularity University. We were sort of a startup of startups ourselves, where we were building entrepreneurship. My team, we were building entrepreneurship programs for people who wanted to build tech companies for social impact. So you can think of things like people building biosensors to test water, people building AI chatbots for mental health, people building the first autonomous aerial vehicles for medical diagnostics and supplies, manufacturing in space, all kinds of stuff. All tended to be very, big global problems, exciting new technologies. And that's where I've spent most of my career to date. Originally my background was in CS and anthropology. I've always been very interested in how people use technology to solve problems. I would argue the thing that makes us human. We tend to be pretty good at it. But what exactly you do with that interest was not immediately clear to me. But ended up working with tech entrepreneurs, and that made sense to me. And that, this journey started all the way back almost a decade ago, when I heard about one of these startups. I was like, this is amazing. This is it. Like, I've always had these interests in tech, but I want to help people do something, big with it, not, just kind of tech for tech's sake, or, be building websites for the rest of my life, which is what I thought I was going to do when I was younger. Turned out that wasn't for me. So I started working at this place called Singularity University. We have a huge focus on entrepreneurship, and a lot of it was really on super early stage teams. We ran every kind of program you can probably think of: incubators, accelerators, corporate innovation programs, pilot programs, helping startups work with enterprises, open innovation challenges, customer development programs, online person, in-pro, co-working spaces. We raised a venture fund. We ended up investing in a bunch of companies. So I got experience in that side of the house as well. Actually really enjoyed that side, but most of this was early stage founders. And so I got to witness a lot of teams who hadn't met each other before, or were organizing around an idea. And then watched over the years, some of these companies I worked with for 7.5 years, seeing what worked and what didn't, and at a really high volume. I mean, we were bringing probably somewhere, 100 to 150 teams a year we ended up working with, probably in some form or another. So we got a lot of insight on what teams worked, which ones didn't. So like I said, I have some thoughts on that, but I think the thing I can do that would be most helpful to you all is share what I learned working with these teams, seeing what worked, what didn't, and hopefully save you some of that heartache early on. That's kind of my life mission, is find the people like yourselves who are doing amazing things, clear out all the BS that makes your jobs and lives hard, and let you focus on the stuff you're really good at. So the first thing I would say is, in terms of general guidelines for building teams, is make sure you're getting the right expertise you need for your team. For example, if you were going to build a banking app, you want to make sure you have someone on your team with some finance experience, right? It's not going to be easy for you. Or, I met one team where they were trying to do this, really out there cannabis startup, but they're all programmers and coders. Maybe they liked the product, but they didn't really have the industry expertise on the team. That just makes it harder. I've seen teams try and make this work, where you put people who are kind of square pegs in round holes, and it usually doesn't work out. I know one team who had their CTO was of a very technical, cutting edge company. Their CTO was someone whose entire experience was finance. And I never really understood why until I talked to them. They didn't have a great reason. It was kind of just by necessity. Long term, that person's not happy. Their co-founders aren't getting what they need out of them. It's not sustainable long term. Also, I would say think about location was another common factor in breakup of teams. That's not to say you can't have remote teams. I think absolutely you can, and maybe should. But you need to be mindful about it. And if you're going to build, if anyone on your team is going to be remote, if 1 out of 5 is going to be remote, you all have to operate like a remote team. And if you're not prepared for that, then, maybe don't do that. Or maybe, you're doing something that's really, we're spending a lot of time in the lab and we need people here on site. If someone's 2 time zones away from you, that just slows things down, makes it harder. Kind of going back to what I said earlier about round pegs and square holes, I think making sure everyone's in the right roles to succeed becomes really important. And that is not always, that's obvious, but what is not always immediately obvious is what roles people should be in. And it's usually, people shouldn't always be in the roles they want to be in. So some people will say, like, yes, I should be the CTO, or I should be the CEO, or I should be doing this. And some people, I would say, are better builders, and some people are better advisors. And this is where I see teams screw this up a lot. And it's not for bad intention. It's, some people are like, yeah, this is amazing, I want to help you. But for people that are really better off in an advisory role, that aren't at a stage in their career, sometimes a lot of very senior people who have a lot of experience can be better advisors. But, and this is not to say all, sometimes those, more senior along in their career people don't really want to, put in the super long hours like they used to anymore. So
Mikhail, you
There's-
brought up a good point. Like
Yeah.
find people who don't, if there's a skill set that is needed to build it, especially in the deep tech, which
Yep.
most of the founders, aspiring founders here are, can you dig deeper into like, okay, how do you pick co-founders? Let's start with the basics, right? And then probably Shravan can chime in, and because you brought up an important point about like some people want to be a CEO, CTO, but then how do you fix each person to be in a role? If you guys can walk through that process, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, I'll say one thing on this and then I'll kick it over to you, Shravan. But I think in terms of you have to have some of those conversations early and they can be difficult of, hey, is this really right? Like, do you really want to be doing this? Like, this is kind of what we expect is going to be needed. And just be willing to revise and adapt where you say like, hey, I know we talked about we're doing this. I think it's not quite working out. I think you'd be better over here. I think I'd be better over here. I think that's totally fine. And we should encourage those conversations. I'd also say really put yourself out there when you're looking for co-founders, particularly like now you're all here, like you have all these connections to university. This is a very great place to find co-founders. It's very fertile grounds. A lot of startups I know that are successful meet people in university or just out of it. And, just put yourself in the places where entrepreneurs and prospective entrepreneurs might go. Organizations like BPEP are fantastic for this. Any kind of entrepreneurship communities, clubs, programs, courses, because then you're meeting people who have that inclination already. And then also networking intentionally with people you know. So maybe I'm building a startup in, I don't know, pick something. I'm building a grocery delivery app. I might ask Naresh, like, hey, I'm building this startup, we're doing grocery delivery, but I'm looking for a CTO that has some experience. Do you know anybody like that? You can get pretty far doing that. So put yourself out there and also really work your network to be intentional with finding the kind of people you need. You can go really far.
That's a great point. Ask around. I think coming to events like BPEP, Foundry has some phenomenal events. Skydeck has events. Like just go around at events. And some of the startups that we founded from BPEP were through organic interactions. People walk and stand in the line during when in-person events. In a pizza line, they started talking. And today they end up raising about $100 million. You'll be surprised what is possible. Shravan, maybe you could shift gears and like probably into your own experience, right? You build teams. We'll talk about founders.
I've been an entrepreneur, I would say, since 2010. So my first job out of school was I was an early engineer at Samba, employee number 2 after the founders. So going in as an individual contributor into an early stage startup, I think is a really valuable experience because you get to see the team structure of a company that is maybe has product market fit or just raised some money. And you learn about a lot of things like cap table structures and equity incentives and how you should think about your roles and responsibilities at different stages of the company. So I joined when the company had a $500K convertible note, and I went on to stay through Series A, close to Series B. So I saw the 3 stages of that company grow. So the company also went through a pivot. So the CEO at that point was initially focused on something functionality is very similar to like what you'd see on like AirPlay today, like something where you could fling video between devices. So they were focused on that product, but then they switched over to TV analytics for linear broadcast television. So joining that ecosystem, the first thing I'd have to point out is the cap table that really worked for them was not an equal split. And I think this is a common mistake that a lot of founders make.
What is the cap table? I think let's go basics because it's an early stage. I think when you talk about pivots, cap tables, I think it'll be really helpful. Please, thank you.
Cap table is essentially the ownership structure, especially if you're doing a Delaware C Corp, then it's the ownership structure is based on the number of shares each shareholder owns. And there's different classes of stock. So usually founders and employees get common stock, investors get preferred stock, which has liquidation preferences. So investors typically consider the cap table as one of the main signals on how to evaluate a company. So is your equity deployed in the right places to make this a scalable company, right? So if you have a lot of early stage founders coming together, I think one of the most important conversations that needs to happen is defining roles and responsibilities, defining ownership structure on the cap table, and then sort of making peace with it once everyone sort of settles on the ownership percentage. I think there's, lots of conflicting advice out there, but from my personal experience, like going back to the anecdotes, I think it's a lot more valuable to have a sort of a cascading ownership structure. So maybe like the CEO gets 24%, CTO gets 18%, and then early stage employees get between 5 to 10%. So a lot of people want to be CEO when they start the company. So, and they don't understand the responsibilities that come from being a CEO versus like the CTO or early stage engineers, right? So CEO is all about defining the vision. It's all about creating a brand around the company. It's about fundraising, making sure people get paid on time. And it's not always as fun as it seems to be, right? So it's a pretty high stress job. And so when you pick your team, you want to make sure you pick someone who has like the mental fortitude and sort of the stamina to like face a lot of rejections. Like one common thing when you're pitching investors is you're going to get a lot of no's in addition to the yeses. So you want to be really have really high conviction for your idea. You want to be impartial, meaning like if you're getting a strong market signal that you need to change strategies, then you have to be flexible in order to do that, right? So I would say the point I'm getting at is different people within the team have to take on different characteristics. Like, so the CEO has to be someone who can rally the team, provide energy, and have the flexibility to adapt to market conditions. The CTO, so this person has to be really good, in addition to the CEO, really good at hiring the right people. And really good at building the underlying foundation. So a startup is essentially the amount of money you bring in versus the amount of money you're spending. If that differential is good, then you can scale. With VC funding, you can accelerate that and operate at a loss for a couple of years to acquire market share in an unfair way. But fundamentally, the scalability of the technology matters, right? So that's the CTO's role, is to understand the product lifecycle, understand the company lifecycle, and understand what are the different stages of the product. So here's the key issue. The team that comes together at the product market fit stage that's helping you doing customer discovery has to evolve into a team that can now deploy $1 to $2 million of capital once you raise your seed round. And then, once you have your first couple reference customers, that team has to now evolve into like a pre-growth or growth stage company where you can start scaling out the sales force and have repeatability to your business. So a lot of people struggle in those transitions, and the team has to come together and sort of cultivate the growth in each individual. And that's what's called change management, right? So basically you have to have the ability to set expectations on how each person's role will change between different stages of financing in the company. And it's better to have these conversations early on. And so these conversations are only possible if you have like a lot of self-awareness. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How can other people on the team augment my weaknesses? And I should, hire better than my own capabilities. And if you have that attitude in your team, then I think you'll have a really strong team. Those are some of the things I've observed at a very high level.
Oh, and you made a lot of good points over there. The first point was like you work for Samba TV, you're the second employee after the CEO. This is some advice we talk about at VPEP. Like, if you don't have any expertise at startups, try and work for startups. It's not a bad thing, because you, as early stage founders, you're going to put in so much. You're going to be doing so many roles. Like you'll be the janitor, you'll be the technician, you'll be the manager, you'll be the CEO. You'll get a chance to grow a lot. So, find startups that can help you. You talked about equity. Maybe Mikhail, let's go a bit deeper into that. Like what are the best practices in terms of, equity split? We've seen cases where 2 founders come together, 3 founders, like, 50-50%, or 33, boom, we're all set. So what is the good thing about that, the bad thing, and what are the better ways to do this?
Yeah, I think Shravan started really well on this point. When you mentioned that there is that tendency towards having an equal split, but I think generally that's not the right move, because it's easier to just say, we're just going to all have an equal slice of the pie and everything's going to be great. We're all going to work equally hard. That's usually not how it shakes out. And it can create some challenges long-term. I think the better thing to do is the harder work, which is sitting down, having a discussion with everyone and saying, okay, appropriate to how many hours we're all going to put in. Maybe I still have my day job, so I can only commit 10 hours a week to this, where as someone else this is their full thing full time. Maybe I bring some critical expertise to this that, this just doesn't work without me. Maybe I get a little more for that. There's a lot of things to consider. So I'm hesitant to say even that there is any one way. But I think you do need to have a you need to look at it through a lot of different lenses and decide what is appropriate for everyone.
Maybe you can give an example, Mikhail. Like say somebody did this 33, 33, 33. If
Oh
somebody
yeah, I mean,
left,
I can give
what
you one.
happens after that?
I can't tell you who it is,
Yeah.
but I know one startup where, they had a 50-50 split or close enough to it. And with no vesting, since we explained cap tables, I'll just quickly say vesting is also something where you earn your equity over a schedule of time. Similar to if you work at a company that gives you stock options, you typically will have to vest to get those shares. That's just, you put in the time and eventually you get the shares. I was working with one company where they had a no vesting 50-50 split. And then they raised a big amount of money and then one of the founders leaves. And now they have this huge dead weight on their cap table from a founder that doesn't work there anymore. And that equity is valuable enough because this company has gotten big enough, there's enough money in it, that it's just this huge problem. It was this huge albatross for the remaining founder. So that's devastating. The way you can mitigate that is with having a vesting schedule. Everybody vests, everybody has deliverables, everybody has an agreed upon. It's like, okay, regardless even of how much equity we're getting, having a schedule for that can help protect you and protect the company long term. It maybe feels a little bad to have those conversations, but I think you have to have them. It's sort of like how nobody gets married expecting to get divorced. Half of marriages still end in divorce, right? 90% of startups don't succeed. So anticipate problems, prepare yourself, protect your company. Have those hard conversations early.
And Naresh, I think one other thing that we should touch upon is do you recruit people that you know, or do you recruit people that it's just a sort of neutral?
Do you bring your friends in, or somebody who has the qualifications to solve a particular problem at the startup? Please elaborate.
But they're not mutually exclusive. I just want so one of the experiences that you have to watch out for is you have to keep your personal and professional life separate if you bring in friends. So people that you have rapport with that can challenge you on on one-on-one basis, they need to, if they're your friend and they have that rapport with you, and in the organizational structure, if you want to maintain a professional sort of environment, in the roles and responsibility definition, once you have this candid one-on-one conversations, I think it's really important to defer to the agreed upon sort of decision at the end of each meeting, even if people disagree. I think the ability to do that really makes a difference between highly successful teams and teams that sort of fall apart. Is the ability to hash it out in a conference room, but when you agree to something, you commit to it, even if you wanted to do something else.
You bring up a very good point. I think the bigger picture in this, I think at startups, egos play a big role. I think you got to leave that ego out of the door. And if you're talking about a decision-making process, you're going to don't feel that you are being attacked personally. The idea, the thought, or the process is being questioned, which is a very healthy process. And it should encourage that if you really want to build a sustainable startup.
So one piece of advice that I got from an advisor that I think would be worth sharing is the product of a startup is not the technology, it's the business model. So the ability to build the business model essentially is what everyone's trying to achieve. And the product is a vehicle to achieve that, right? So when egos come into play, I think reminding people that, hey, we need to be agile, we need to get the product market fit and get to scale with the least amount of runway wasted is the key goal. So I think having a framework around that is sometimes helpful.
That's a nice segue, probably. The question that is very dear to my heart. And, as scientists, I think most of the audience here is grad students and postdocs. We love the technology that we're working on. And Mikhail, maybe you can take a stab at this. You see a lot of deep tech startups, and there's a love for technology and there's a love for market, and share your experiences of loving your technology and not focusing too much on market, and where is the balance, and where do these founders need to pay attention about?
Yeah, that's a very common problem because to start something like this, to go on this kind of very difficult endeavor, you have to have a lot of conviction and a lot of belief in what you're doing. The challenge can be if you start, I think when you start ignoring signals from the market. I've known startups where they're really dead set on this is our thing, we really want to do it. And then you start getting out to the market, you're doing your customer development, you're doing interviews, you're talking to people, you're talking to prospective customers, and you're getting different feedback. And people are saying that, yeah, actually not so much this, but could you do this for us? Could you do option B? And if you keep ignoring option, if you keep hearing, hey, we don't want A, we want B, and you keep pushing forward with A, trying to force it, it usually doesn't work out. That's not to say abandon anything at the first sign of rejection. And that's the difficult balance, right? Is kind of, I think, knowing when to pivot and when to be open to new opportunities, when to stick to your guns, so to speak. But don't ignore those market signals. Do the work, do your research, talk with people that you trust in your industry who also give you an honest opinion are super, super valuable. A mentor of mine I trust dearly. And if they told me, hey, you know what, I know you're pushing forward on this thing and I really don't think it's working out for you, and I also happen to work in this field, I would take that very seriously, more so than if some random interview I catch with just, maybe gives me a positive yes or no. And I think also really asking hard questions, or I shouldn't say hard questions, asking better questions becomes very important. A lot of people will do very easy customer discovery where they'll say, hey, Naresh, if I could solve all your problems for $5, would you be willing to pay that? You'll say, yeah, sure. Okay. Like $5. When the reality is that's not close to what I'm doing. We'd say like, hey, for $5 a month, would you be, you have to give people a more realistic question and not leading questions, open-ended questions, not asking, hey, would you do this? How much would you pay for this? How much do you think this is worth? Ask people more open-ended, quantifiable questions, I think can be very valuable.
Shravan, you want to jump in? Maybe you can give some examples of like what you set out as a hypothesis for the product you're trying to build, what you heard from the market, and how you pivoted to suit the market needs. And because at the end of the day, it's a business. It's not a love affair with your technology. It's about making money. How you evolved, if you can give some examples.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about Civil Maps here. So that's my second company that I started. And so here we basically, the approach we took is what are the top 10 problems that we're passionate about? And the key considerations that we took was, the different topics of research or different problems that have the most impact. And we listed down the top 10. And out of those, we figured out which ones we can actually contribute to. And so when we started doing customer development, a lot of assumptions that we had, turned out to be not true. So when Civil Map started, initially it was doing wireless.
What is Civil Map? Maybe you can tell what Civil Maps is about a bit more, please.
Yeah, Civil Map, well, I was kind of getting to it because it evolves, right? So initially we were doing smart perimeter security with wireless sensor networks. So the idea was to use mesh networking to trigger alarms if the fence is breached or some certain vibrations are detected. And so the initial target customer for that was Chevron, which is based in Richmond. But that was like a very niche market segment, and we didn't think it was a big market. And there's a lot of different players. So then we pivoted to vibration testing on rail networks to see if the wireless mesh networking could be useful for track maintenance on trains, because whenever there's a flat wheel, the train will actually pound on the railroad track. And so as we had these conversations with the railroad operators, they said, hey, that doesn't seem like a scalable way to build this. Can you use machine vision instead? We have all these LiDAR sensors on our trains generating terabytes of data per day. And what we quickly realized is their data collection capabilities were quite advanced, but their human annotation process that they used to create these 3D maps were quite poor. And so for every 1 hour of data collection, they were taking 88 hours of manual data processing. And so we saw a signal there, like this is a key problem that the customer is struggling with. Is this specific to the railroad industry, or is it a common problem everywhere? So then we talked to PG&E, and PG&E has the same problem. Like they have to trim all of their trees to make sure that they don't grow close to the power transmission lines. And then we talked to the Department of Transportation. So they use LiDAR scanning for detecting potholes. So throughout the industry, everything from oil and gas, construction, to trains, they were all using this LiDAR point cloud data sets, and the tooling to actually process that data was quite poor. So that was one example where the customer discovery really, led the horse to the water. And it was kind of our responsibility to say that, hey, look, the signal is saying this is a valuable piece of technology, and we have the core expertise to work on it. So why don't we go after this problem? And so that's when we created Civil Maps, which is focused on point cloud data processing using cloud infrastructure. This is sometime in 2015. And we started initially working with heavy industry, but then we were approached by the automotive companies saying, hey, can you use this for self-driving cars? So then, we were approached by Ford, Honda, Daimler, several other companies. And we started working on these HD maps. So fast forward to 2019, a lot of the self-driving car companies were restricted to geofenced areas. So they didn't have the appetite to pay for these maps at a large scale. So that was one of my motivations for starting Hyperspec. So I wanted to focus on a scalable mapping technology that doesn't require any annotation tooling, but rather can create the map in real time on the edge. So that's kind of, how customer discovery can lead you down a path, and something that you find correct in 2015, the market can evolve past that. So it's not like you do customer discovery, get product market fit, and you're done. You have to continuously do that process on a quarterly or annual basis and track, the market and which way it's going. And you want to get ahead of the market. You want to build a product that can time the market to get that advantage. So I would say, that's a core piece of the CEO's job, and even the CTO, and then the chief product officer, if you have one.
That's a fascinating story about how Civil Maps evolved. I'll take a different angle to this. Maybe you both can jump in. Like, not every customer's feedback is going to be good feedback. Sometimes they may lead you into some rabbit hole. It'll be hard for you to get out of those things, especially in the deep tech space. Most people say you're coming up with a therapeutic company, diagnostic, or some mapping technology here. You have some insight with the technology that it takes time to get to the market, about 5-10 years. Check if it's going to be relevant in 5 to 10 years, number one. Number two, I think, it's a futuristic product. How do they balance, Mikhail? Like, there's immediate feedback from contemporaries. If they look at Honda as a better competitor or as a better company than you as a startup, how do they balance? And like, who do you talk to as a founder in terms of adoption, and not go down the rabbit holes, the wrong ones? What is a good customer? What is a bad customer? Shravan, where you led down a wrong way and you had to path cut and come back again.
Mikhail, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a lot there. In terms of who is a good customer or not, I think that talking to people in your industry who have a very people affected by the problem you're trying to solve is ultimately the most important. You can get broader than that. It's tempting to just speak to like, oh, hey, you're generally in this industry. What do you think about this? But I think also, one of the founders I work with summarized this really well. He said, it's usually not the biggest players are usually not your best customers because they don't have a need as much as that second tier. And this was somebody building like enterprise software essentially, but it's like the big guys, they don't need us yet. They control the market. They don't have as urgent a need. They have a lot more resources. That second tier of large, but not at the same level, not the Fortune 1000 companies. They really are looking for an edge, and they are more willing to collaborate, try something new, work with startups. So talking with folks who are closer to the need, whether that's B2B, B2C, whatever, I think is really important. And I think the timing too, like you're talking about, is really important, because sometimes I've worked with a lot of founders who are really forward thinking, and they're thinking this is going to be a huge industry, or this is going to be a huge problem for this industry, and we need to solve it. And then they get out into the market and they find out like people are like, yeah, maybe it will be, but we're not even thinking about that yet. Like, we have much more immediate needs now. And you can roadmap that. You can say like, okay, 5 to 10 years, this is where we think the big action is going to be. What do we do now? And ideally, what can we build that will be complementary to what we want to be doing further on in our roadmap? This is kind of the job of the leadership, to develop that roadmap and plan. but it's super important.
Cool. Let me think. Good customer. I think a good customer is someone who can help you learn the language of a customer. So like if you're thinking about your product and you want to take your product to market, the customer doesn't care about what the company has to say. They care about how you solve the problem. So it's a very important distinction. I could introduce Hyperspec as saying, Hyperspec is a company based out of San Francisco, has 8 developers. We have like computer vision experience, and these are things that we're good at. Like if I pitch it in that way, it's not received very well. So a good customer is someone who can help you establish the language that conveys the value proposition that you deliver to the customer. So someone who gets on the phone with you and says, hey, these are the problems, and sort of, it's kind of your responsibility to take that information and sort of translate that pitch, right? So if I were to repitch Hyperspec, I would say something like 97% of US roadways are inaccessible to autonomous vehicles. And that's mainly because high definition maps are not as pervasive as everyone thought they would be. And we solve that problem by fusing data with aerial imagery, enabling autonomous cars to drive everywhere. So like if that language, if you notice, I don't really talk about Hyperspec. I don't really talk about our team. It's not about me, it's about the customer, right? So learning the language of the customer and being able to convey the value proposition is, I think, the best sort of language a founder should start adopting. And that's what really drives success. Because when they meet with you, they're basically looking for that confirmation that you understand their problem so they can invest time and money and resources engaging with a small company like yours, right? So I think those are the good customers. The bad customers, like you said, you get these one-off feature requests, other use cases, or they're more, it's more trouble than the compensation that you're getting. But at some point, like if your product is robust enough and you have a large enough company, these types of customers still build value, but they wouldn't be like what I would call your beachhead customer.
As founders, how do you deal with that? Like we tend to say yes early stage because like we're trying to find those customers. We're always hopeful that if we solve this one problem for them, they might become our customers. There's that hope, which might not always translate to a customer. Like how do you?
The way we deal with it is we have a case study document that we complete as soon as we have the customer discovery, even before we build out the product, right? So we basically have a conversation with the customer. They describe their problem, and then we create a sample case study, which is like that describes the value proposition and the acceptability criteria that customer shared with us. We take that case study and we present it to other prospective customers that have the same archetype as the initial customer and see if that's a repeatable value proposition. And if you get that signal from multiple customers that yes, like what you're saying makes sense, we're also looking to solve that problem, then you invest the time and resources into building out the full product. You've got to be careful. Like you don't want to go after every customer because you might burn a couple relationships that way because you're not quite ready in your product. But it's good to validate an assumption from more than one interaction.
That's such an important point. Validation. Like don't try to build a feature, one-off features that is away from your roadmap, just to convince some one-off customer. They might not be able to scale. So test that hypothesis. A great.
You could do a rule of 3.
Yeah.
And I get 3 people to say yes to this thing.
Yeah.
And say it's valuable. And then if that's the case, then I think you sort of have a pattern.
Yeah, it's about 6:50. I just want to open up the window to others to ask questions so that probably we can help them guide this conversation as well. Any questions out there?
Yeah, I did have a question about the overall competitive landscape of your technology. Once you're ready to put out a product to the market, what's the best way of trying to get a feel for the competitive landscape that's out there and how that competitive landscape may be changing over time once your business is successful? And how do you deal with any pressure that may emerge when your competitors are putting out certain things, and how to deal with pressure that may put on you and your company to put out a certain product at a certain time, and how that may influence how fast you go through a pipeline that you may have for generating that product.
You want to go first, Mikhail?
Sure. Yeah, I think you got to at least know, you have to do your research, which I know might sound silly, but a lot of people don't. I talk to companies every so often that are like, we are the first ones doing this. Anytime I see that, I look it up. And if they are not the first ones doing it, that's a huge red flag. And making sure that you've done your research. And that's not to say you have to be. It's okay to be in a competitive landscape. Competition is not always a bad thing. Competition is also validation. If it shows like, hey, there's a real market here, there's a real need. I think it's important to define how you fit into that ecosystem. There's certainly no shortage of entrepreneurship programs and accelerators in Silicon Valley in the world. Anytime we've been building programs, it's like, okay, what's the lane we want to be in here? Who is the audience that we feel we can really help, we can solve a real need for, and is not really yet being met by what's currently on the market. I think there's a good, you asked also about like, okay, their future developments, how does that fit in? That can be harder to find. Sometimes people who kind of are insiders and can tell you like, hey, this is where they're moving towards, or, oh, I know these folks are having a problem with this thing they're doing. That sort of intel becomes super valuable. But staying on top of everything that, not everything, but, staying aware of your competition and where they're moving becomes really important. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to having good information, understanding where you fit in the market, and really just picking, especially as an early stage company, your resources are limited. You can't do everything, particularly if you're competing against some bigger players. But what you do have is speed. And if you can move faster in an important area, you can establish, a nice foothold that you can grow into.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
I agree with everything Mikhail said. I think in addition to that, something that's really important is to identify a market gap. So you could have a product roadmap that's like competing with a lot of people, but identify a small sliver of functionality that is unique to you that really drives the needle in terms of value proposition. The second thing is the stickiness of your actual product experience, right? So you have your cost to customer acquisition, which is like the amount of resources your company spends to get customers, then the amount of resources that you spend to grow that customer into a bigger sort of revenue stream, and then your churn rate, like how many customers are you losing on a monthly or quarterly basis. So once you understand these three metrics, you can invest resources into like account management or customer success teams. So these people basically are trying to engage the customers, grow the accounts, or if the customer is on their way out and you have some churn, you want to do some exit interviews where you ask the customer for feedback on why they're leaving, and use that as a feedback loop to like plug the holes in your product experience, right? So initially when you go to market, your churn rate will be higher. So the companies that do really well are the ones that sort of focus on each stage of their funnel independently. So they're not conflating different variables, and they optimize each stage of the funnel. And then you get to a point where you can outscale your competition. So just because a competitor has the same messaging doesn't mean they have the same product experience. So when you create your product and you have your customer engagement model or your script, basically you need to focus on the stickiness and focus on strategies to sort of outscale your competition. I've seen a lot of small companies get really big wins against larger players because they focus on something really important and to a smaller segment of the overall market. And they dominate that small segment, and that becomes their cash cow. Now they can, sort of diversify and sort of scale up adjacent verticals or additional functionalities to increase their feature set.
Awesome. Thank you, Shravan and Mikhail. I want to take back some more fundamental questions about like, how do you hire people and how do you retain them, especially if you're in the Valley? Like it's hard to compete with Facebook or an Apple with the salaries. How do you keep them? How do you retain them? How do you let them go? If you can cover that whole spectrum, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would say that you don't have, so you're absolutely right, Naresh. There is a lot of competition now. There's, especially from the big companies, are putting a lot of pressure on talent. There are armies of recruiters out there just trying to get people in, and not even necessarily from you in startups, but just from each other. And you're not generally going to be able to compete with them on salary or quality of life, unless you can match Google's we take care of everything, you get a massage at your desk kind of lifestyle. You're probably not going to be able to do that for a while. But there are things you do have to offer in terms of there's a lot of room for growth. There's a lot of opportunity for wearing different hats, having a multidisciplinary role. You can learn so much working at a startup, because you have to when you're a small team, everybody kind of does everything. And also you can really sell people on the mission. I think this is a key advantage a lot of deep tech or mission driven companies have. People solving big problems is, it might be, your quality of life might be very good working for a big company, but it can be easy to kind of feel like, a cog in the machine. Maybe it's a machine making things you don't even really care about. But you have a unique competitive advantage as a startup founder of, hey, you get to be the person doing this. You get to grow. You will, there's so much opportunity for growth here. And we're doing something really important and exciting. And I want to tell you why. This is another job of leaders on teams, is to get people excited about the opportunity. Employees, investors, customers, one of the critical skills you have to have is being able to effectively sell your mission in your company, because you're a small company, you don't have a lot of resources, people are going to have to keep taking chances on you, and you have to convince them that not only, oh, yeah, maybe sure they could do it, but hell yeah, I want them to do it and I want to help. That's the best position you can be in.
Shravan, you build teams as well.
Yeah.
Walk us through a scenario, like a good hire or a bad hire. How did you convince them to stay back, and how did you let them go if it's not a good fit?
So my overall hiring thesis is, how do I hire people that can augment me or do a better job than me, so that I can, reduce my responsibilities in that area. So I follow like a servant style leadership. So the concept of servant style is you basically give people a lot of autonomy, and you figure out where you can unblock them. And typically that leads to more ownership, more accountability, and it leads to higher performing teams. And the role really is about providing a supporting role. A lot of people underestimate the amount of training infrastructure they need to build to create a high quality employee. They expect to just hire someone and have them understand all their processes and understand all of the nuances of what you want from them. So fundamentally, I think one of the key issues that a lot of startups lack is communication. So setting expectations, having a training process for the first 6 months, saying like, these are our processes, these are our handoffs between different teams, and these are the roles and responsibilities. Like, people take some time to become useful to a company. And I know startups move fast, but having some flexibility and giving people time to grow is key. I think the second thing that's really important in hiring is giving people a notion of safety. When people feel safe, they go to greater lengths to help you out. So when that notion of safety is compromised, then they're not going to be emotionally vested in your company. So if your employees know that you have their back, then they're going to be more vested in your success. But for example, if entrepreneurs are sort of detached from day-to-day interactions with employees, then typically they'll be a bit more they'll treat it like a 9-to-5 job, and that is not as great for a startup. That being said, I think if you look at cadence, I've seen the best cadence from teams that measure 6-month cadence instead of biweekly cadence. So most teams operate on a weekly or biweekly sprint schedules. And so the teams that perform best over long periods of time have a rotation in terms of being, in the middle of a sprint, having some time to cool down and do documentation, and then having some time to do planning for the next sprint or doing research spikes or benchmarking. So having this concept of rotation, so people know that they're in the middle of a sprint, and this is mission critical, and you set their expectations that these next 2 weeks might be longer than 9 to 5, but the following 2 weeks will, they can plan their vacations during the documentation weeks because it's not as crucial for them to do things. So setting expectations properly, I think, and creating a sense of safety, And then also having a good training process typically creates high performing teams. And then hiring people better than you. I think that's really key.
Yeah, I want to add on to what you said, which I think, you talked about safety and communication are super important. I completely agree. One thing I wanted to mention when we were thinking about, having this talk today was really emphasizing that trust is critical for your team, because it's hard to feel safe if you can't trust someone. It's hard to have good communications if you don't trust people. Really making sure you invest, particularly in your first few hires, the time to build relationships with the rest of your colleagues, all your reports, is super valuable. Someone I know who's much smarter than me about building teams really hammered this home when he said, trust from an employee will look like an unhappy employee will be, hey, I'm thinking about leaving. If you can tell your boss, your supervisor, that you're unhappy enough, things are going well, that you're even thinking about leaving, think about how much trust that takes. Maybe you've had that in career, maybe you haven't. I've been lucky enough that I have had, relationships with managers or supervisors that were that good. An unhappy employee that doesn't trust you will say, I quit. And when you talk about, how do you know when to let people go? If you've invested in the time in your people to make sure that, like Siobhan's saying, that you are training them well, that they understand what's expected of them, that you're checking in with them, there shouldn't be any surprises. There shouldn't be surprises if someone is going to be let go or if someone's going to leave. If I'm meeting with the report regularly and they're hammering in all their deliverables, they understand what they need to do and they're going out and they're doing it. That's great. If there's problems that arise, things they're getting stuck on, they're consistently not meeting, what's asked of them. We've talked about it. It's not getting addressed and things aren't getting better. I think that's when you have to start, having those harder conversations of like, look, we really need this and this. Is there something I can do for you? Like, how can we get this fixed? And if that's not still happening, I think that's your sign that things aren't working out. But again, takes that investment of time and trust, which is hard to do because, at startups, you have too much to do all the time. And sometimes you're trying to cut corners and things. Let's be honest, a lot of startups tend to not really look, I think, at HR or their human capital as important as it maybe really is. And I think that usually comes back to bite them in the butt. I think if you invest in your people and you develop relationships of trust with them and autonomy, like Siobhan was saying, that almost always pays off in my experience.
Yeah, I think the hiring process is super key there. A company, once it makes a hire, it spends a lot of resources making that employee make meaningful contributions to the organization. So a bad hire is very costly. So if during the hiring process, if you're not sure, it's better to wait or defer that decision than to bring on board a bad hire, because you need someone to do that work. You can also do things like bring people on a contract basis for a couple of months to evaluate how they would work with you before making them full-time as well. I think it's really key, when a company makes a commitment to a hire, that they fully vetted them and they understand, if this person's a good fit or not. Because the flip side is if you do let go of people, it does affect trust. Even if it's perfectly, if that decision was based on merit and there was performance issues, trust still gets affected in terms of people feeling unsafe. So it's really good to optimize the hiring process, invest in HR, like Mikhail said, and change management, and try to get your hit rate between hire to retention to be pretty good.
Yeah, hiring is expensive, turnover is expensive. Avoid it, at all costs.
Like, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So yeah, I guess first thing, just wanted to react to something that Mikhail said when you were asking about how do you find people or onboard people. As someone, I was a second hire at a startup for my first job after my postdoc. And I realized that it's kind of a self-selecting group of people who want to work at a startup that size. So I don't know if it's, necessarily like if you have to convince someone that you want to, that they should join a startup with that risk and that exposure, that's probably a bad sign. I'm just saying, as someone who's on the side of wanting to be hired, I was drawn to the risk I was drawn to the opportunity. And most of all, I was drawn to the impact, the idea that you could be 1/3 of a solution instead of 1/15,000th or 1/100,000th of Genentech or whatever. So it's like, that's insane. So anyway, I did have a question. As someone who's kind of a brand new founder myself, about onboarding advisors. And I've heard like a couple of things. So I've been trying to target more kind of well-established, prestigious, kind of elite, well-known entities in the field to my advisory board, but they're very hard to get to. And they'd be very hard to convince, especially if I'm not directly connected to them, that they should take a risk investing any time, a second of their time on me. Even though they could make a huge impact if they really wanted to help. On the other hand, it would be relatively easy to populate my advisory board with much more junior people. However, that would elicit, sighs or eye rolls potentially from investors who might not believe that I've assembled enough traction or credibility.
Right. So it's a question about like, how do you enroll good advisors that you want that bring value?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Mikhail, Shravan, you both have done that.
Shravan, you wanna start?
Yeah. I actually started using a tool called Lunch Club. I don't know how many of you guys use that. So Lunch Club is like a 1-hour meeting tool. It's basically invite only, but I can, if anyone wants to join, I can drop you guys a link. But essentially, a lot of my advisors I've met through Lunch Club. And so they pair you up with people that are domain experts in your field, or that have similar interests, or you can specifically list asks in Lunch Club and they network you with folks. So if you do 3 to 4 meetings per week, I've had pretty good luck. I also met one of my investors in Hyperspec through that service as well. And he happened to be the ex-chief innovation officer at IBM. And so prior to that, he was at McKinsey. So he's like well connected with like a lot of Fortune 100 companies, and acting as a McKinsey consultant with those guys. So I think the fundamental key to getting advisors or investments or hiring or anything is just the speed at which you can network and the tools that you can use to expand your network very rapidly. The higher quality network that you develop, you basically self-select into a better advisory group, right? So I think if you get one of those folks to champion you, then you have, their network that you could sort of see, who's in their LinkedIn, second degree connections, and ask for an introduction. And then that will have a lot more merit than you reaching out directly, for example. Yeah, those are some of the techniques that I've used.
Mikhail, you help people from Foundry. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think, I have usually been fortunate to be in a position of working at incubators, accelerators that have very robust networks that, we generally have never had a problem connecting with some very high level people. So I'm not sure I can really speak to like getting the grind to get the hard folks. That's maybe one advantage of joining, a program like that, is joining a program that can bring you into a big and important, valuable network quickly. Something that's aligned with your industry is very important. If you're an IoT startup, it probably doesn't make sense to join something that doesn't have a lot of strong connections there, and so on. So I think joining networks, and Lunch Club can be another one like that, like finding networks where you can find the right people is good. I would also, though, caution that there are sometimes people who are big splashy names that maybe don't necessarily put in the same level of work or input as someone who's a little more junior in their career. That's something I've seen happen a lot, where you get founders who are, and sometimes there's a trade-off to be made there, and like, yep, this person wants a decent amount of equity and they're not willing to commit to much, but just having their network and expertise in the slide, if they give me 3 things, it'll be worth it. Maybe you make that call. But also, be diligent with bringing in advisors like you would be team members. I think is really, really important.
Thank you. Can I ask a kind of follow-on question? I've been recently alerted to a catch-22 problem, yet another catch-22 problem that founders face. and I'm not sure I really buy it, but I'm curious to know what your feedback is. I was told that it makes sense that if you're funded and you have money, when you offer equity to an advisor, it's more compelling. On the other hand, if you're not well, then if you're not funded, well, then how do you get you see what I'm saying? So what do you think there's merit to that? Is that something I should be losing sleep over, or it's just like just another thing to grind it?
Yeah, I think there's a kernel of truth in there that, like, sure, like I would rather be an advisor to a company that's in their Series B than a company that has nothing, right? But in my experience, that hasn't been. I've met so many companies that have $0 to their name, but still were able to recruit really exciting people because they're doing something exciting. They're doing something cool. You know, it's not the end all be all. I wouldn't worry about, like, you can definitely build a strong advisory board if you're not funded yet.
One way to get people that will build a lot of value is to go to conferences or standards groups where you have sort of the thought leaders converging in one location, and just be part of that conversation. Even if you don't contribute, just like ask really intelligent questions, and start developing those relationships. And then hopefully some of those will mature into like an advisory relationship or even a friendship, right? Like you can just ask questions. It doesn't always have to be formal. In our case, two of our advisors are informal, more in the friends category, but they have really meaningful advice. And then two of our advisors are actually on our cap table.
You'd be surprised how many contacts you can make asking around just at university. When I founded my company, I had nobody. It started with one person, ended up with the director of sales for Philips joined the team as an advisor, marketing director from Siemens joined the team. So they will have connections, but ask around. Don't be disappointed by one person saying no. There are many of those kinds. Yeah. But
so one interesting exercise is try to get 10 no's.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Like you would think getting 10 no's is easy, but like if you try to get 10 no's, that means you'll probably get 20 yeses. And then you have a good selection of people that you can bring on your board.
I think that's a really good strategy because it also, I mean, that works for investing too, right? It's setting a goal for rejections because it kind of prepares you for what's to come, and take some of the power out of that rejection. It feels less like soul crushing and more like, well, all right, check it off the list. It's the same thing when you're looking for jobs or doing anything that requires a high volume of work. I think with a low success rate. One last thing I'll say on that, on kind of the networking and advisory side, is a hack that an old colleague of mine taught, which is a little bit of an exponential growth with anyone you talk to who could be an interesting advisor or collaborator. You just ask like, hey, can you think of 2 people I should talk with about this that might be interested? Just ask for 2. People can usually think of 2 other people that they can connect you with that would be interested in what you're doing. Then you ask those 2 when you meet them for 2 more, and so on and so on. So that's just an easy kind of networking trick.
And those are such good learning experiences. You can actually follow up and ask, oh, you said no, I know you might be tied with time. Is there a reason why you don't want to be an advisor? But such strong learning lessons, even from an investor or an advisor. I think it's easy to get dejected, but use it to your advantage. Shravan, it's about 7:20. Are there any parting lessons? If you want the audience to walk away with 1 or 2 points about teams.
Yeah. I'll try not to take too much time. Basically, one framework that was very useful for us is we did a self-awareness exercise where people took like a personality test, and it sort of shows you like passions, expectations, how people think about outcomes, and how they think about process. So passions is basically like, what are people motivated by? Are they motivated by like vision? Are they motivated by process? Are they motivated by relationships? Are they motivated by outcomes? And individuals will have certain expectations for themselves and certain expectations for others. And those are not necessarily congruent. So when we had this compiled report, we actually used it as a framework to create social contracts within the team. For someone, it was really important to have like a lot of flexibility to try different things, and they didn't want to be beholden to process, but they had the expectation that their teammates should follow process very thoroughly. And they actually get really stressed out when the environment is not predictable. And this is an individual that does contribute a lot of value. So I'm understanding like these little nuances about each individual on your team, and then starting to build like a social fabric or social contract between all the teammates actually helps the velocity of the company a lot. And so that's something that I started delving into on my third startup that I had no experience with on my first and second ones. And it's a day and night difference in terms of team culture.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
why
I
you-
love that. And
Yeah.
I would say we use that a bit in my experience as well, where with our very first accelerator we ever built, building from the ground up, we did a similar thing. I'll put it in the chat. I think it's called Strengths Profile. I've done a ton of these things. There's a million of them out there. I think some are better than others. This one is very good. And what I think when you look at it at a team level, it gets really interesting because you can find gaps. You can say like, oh, no one on our team is really that inclined to be organized. We should really make sure that with our next hire, we kind of select for that a little bit and try and find someone who can help keep us from, just living in refuse with documents everywhere. And even within people who are already on your team, I won't forget that I had one of my colleagues, she and I were like complete opposites in terms of working style, like oil and water. But what we found was that her weaknesses, my weaknesses were her strengths and vice versa, which became super valuable because she was like a rocket. She would just go, wouldn't worry about like, let's just build it, ship it, go. I was more of like, hey, let's check, sure, let's poke some holes in this. When it doesn't work, let's reconfigure it so it does. So it was a really useful thing for us to know because I could say, hey, I need to get something off the ground. I'm going to talk to her. We're going to just get it out there. And then she, on the opposite side, would say like, hey, I'm building this thing. What do we need to think about after it launches? That kind of information can be really handy. And like I said, I've done a bunch of, there's one that's called Strengths Finder. I'll put it in the chat. It's not a plug. They don't pay me. But I got a lot out of it. It's the best one I've used.
Great. Any parting lessons from you, Mikhail?
I would say the big, if I could change one thing about startup culture and teams is, actually, okay, it's two things. Sorry, I'll be quick. The first one is you don't need to be a tyrant. I think a lot of people go into entrepreneurship with the expectation that like, oh, I need to be the boss, I need to be the decider, and I need to be really be a hard ass on everybody all the time. That can work for some people. From what I've seen, it usually doesn't. The more successful founders I have worked with over the last almost decade have been very collaborative people. Startups are ultimately, this is my thesis, a people business, because so much of what you do is dependent on your ability to influence other people, your ability to recruit people, your ability to get the most out of those people. It's so much of this is interpersonal, and I think you really have to be, kind of to what Shravan was saying, like take a servant attitude towards this and really invest in your people, build them up, give them opportunities for growth. Doesn't do you a lot of good to just be all, vinegar all the time. The second thing I would say is, no, I think that pretty much covers it.
I think we have a question in the chat. Could you explain?
Cap structure.
Yeah.
Take that, Shravan?
Typically, I think it's kosher to do 2 to 3% for advisors at the seed stage. And it's common stock. I haven't seen advisors get preferred stock. I don't see why they should get liquidation preferences. And at later stages, obviously they would get less ownership commensurate to the company's valuation.
Yeah, it can get pretty small down to, there's advisors who get 0.25%, 0.5%, 1%.
Depending on
That's
the
not-
contributions, basically.
Yeah.
No, great points. Shravan, he said, you can understand the personality types of the fellow teammates, so it can work better. Mikhail said, don't be a tyrant. Be collegial. Those are great closing points. I want to thank the speakers, Mikhail and Shravan, for sharing your experiences. I'm sure I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody here learned a lot too. But we're hoping to work with you guys on this BPAP workshops in the future as well. But yeah, thank you all for coming.
I think generally, whenever you're building a team, whether it's hires, co-founders, advisors, investors, you generally really want to get along with anybody you bring on board. And I know that might sound obvious, but it's not. And a lot of times people will bring people like, oh, this person's got just the right skill set, or they got the big name, or they got the big money. And the reality I think that sometimes people forget is it takes a long time to build a successful business. And these are people you're probably gonna be working with for a long time, and sort of, think of it as like a big voyage. Back in the day when people would sail around the world and it would take years, like you're kind of doing a similar thing here. You're bringing people on board that you're going to be working with potentially for years. I never want to work with anybody that I don't absolutely really like working with. We made some of those mistakes early on, and I think just making sure that you get a good read, finding on people kind of early on, you kind of know, I think to some extent, if you can get along with somebody or not, becomes really important.